Right, so hello everyone, I'm Will Johnson, and as Matthew said, I work at ULAS, and in fact I'm coming to you live from the Finds Lab down at ULAS, so please try to ignore the chaos that's happening behind me. And I have been working here for, must be almost 5 years now, actually. And I specialize in post-excavation, so I work in the lab. People bring me finds from the site and I'm part of the team that helps clean them up and work out what's going on. And I'm particularly interested in animal bones and oyster shells. And it's oyster shells I'm going to be talking to you about today. So to begin with, I thought I'd just give you a very brief basic introduction to the biology and some of the terminology that I'm going to be using through the talk, because some of it is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try and explain it right up front, and then it'll hopefully make a bit more sense as we go through. So to begin with, when I'm talking about oysters, I'm specifically referring to the European flat oyster, scientific name Ostrea edulis, which is the UK's native oyster that's been around throughout history, prehistory, and it's only recently that it's fallen into a sharp decline and been almost replaced by imported oysters from elsewhere. So if you go to a shopping centre or restaurant and you get oysters today, it's unlikely that you're going to be dealing with the European flat oyster, but that is the one that has been the dominant oyster throughout British history. So to begin with, oysters are bivalved mollusks, which simply means that it's a slimy little animal that lived sandwiched between two shells, each shell being referred to as a valve. Now, at the start of the oyster life cycle, it emerges from the oyster egg, and it has a free-swimming larval stage where it bobs around in the sea looking for a place to settle. And it'll land on various surfaces and swim off again until it finds somewhere where it wants to live. And once it's got to the end of this stage, it will secrete a glue-like substance from the shell and attach itself to the substrate that it lands on. And from that point onwards, it will be a permanent fixture on that substrate. So unless something happens, like a person comes along and breaks it off, or there's a severe tidal conditions, the oyster will spend its entire life cemented to the substrate that it settles on. From there, the oyster will grow, and the way it grows is it's got an internal organ called the mantle, and this is in contact with the shell, and it basically secretes the minerals and enzymes and proteins that are required to reduce new shell. And it does this at the margins of the shell, resulting in a growth pattern of concentric rings. Can you see my mouse pointer on the screen? I'm not. So if you see on this one, you get a series of concentric rings radiating out. So the pointed end here is the oldest part of the oyster, and then as it grows, it just gets longer and longer. And similarly to tree rings, each of these lines represents a period of growth of the shell. So the oysters are what are technically called inequivalved, which is a very fancy way of saying the two valves, i.e. the two sides of the shell, are not symmetrical and they have different features. So the left valve, to differentiate between the left and the right valve, the left valve is the larger of the two valves, and it's concave or cupped, and it's inside this valve that the actual oyster creature lives. So it basically lives inside this cupped valve. The left valve is quite easy to identify because it's got these it's more frilly on the shell outline, and then it's got these ribs that radiate down the length of the shell from the hinge. So it's got a bumpy surface texture going across the shell. The right valve is slightly smaller, and it actually sits inside the left valve. And it is flat, and it essentially acts as the lid for the oyster. So the two valves are joined together at the bottom at what's called the hinge, and inside the hinge, which is this little scar here at the bottom, there's a ligament that holds the two shells together. And then in the center of the oyster, there is a large muscle that connects to the two valves called the adductor muscle, and it connects to the top and bottom valve. As you can see, it leaves this sort of scar behind on the shell. And by relaxing and contracting this muscle, the oyster can basically open and close the right valve to make a lid. So it'll open it when it wants to feed, because oysters are filter feeders. And then if it's ever under stress from predators or adverse conditions, it will contract that muscle, close the two valves tightly together. And yeah, at that point, the oyster will be closed. So the main thing to think about when we're going throughout this talk is just remember that when I say valve, I'm essentially referring to one half of the shell, and the left valve is the deeper cupped valve and the right valve is the smaller flat valve. So that's a brief introduction to the sort of the biology and some of the terminology that I'm going to be using in the talk. I can now turn to the historical and archaeological side of things. So oysters have been consumed sort of throughout history. In Britain, there's evidence of oysters being gathered for consumption going back at least 2,000 years. But during this time, there's been fluctuations in their status and how popular they are and the quantity that are being consumed. So a very quick historical overview. During the Iron Age, so we're talking sort of just over 2,000 years ago, oysters aren't really being eaten that much. They're only turning up on Iron Age sites that are actually situated on the coast. And basically, it's people just walking along the coast. And then if the oysters are exposed at low tide, they're just walking along and gathering them by hand. There's no evidence of any kind of commercialized aspect of it. The oysters aren't being transported anywhere. We're only just finding the shells on these coastal sites. However, then the Romans come along and everything sort of kicks off because the Romans are massively fond of their oysters. And during the Roman period, sort of 1st century through to the 4th century, there's a huge sort of boom in oysters being exploited. They turn up in huge quantities at all kinds of Roman sites. We're talking coastal sites, but inland, Leicester, they've found them in Scotland at Roman forts. So the Romans love their oysters and are prepared to put in the effort to get them from the coast to the inland sites where they want to eat them. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, there is a fall in the popularity of the oyster that goes along with it. And essentially, we get to the Saxon, early medieval period. And again, oysters are being fairly restricted and are only turning up on coastal sites. There's a bit of travel inland, but we're not seeing the huge quantities of shell that were being shifted that we were seeing in the Roman period. However, as the medieval period progresses, this changes, and we start seeing the development of what we might recognize as more commercialized oyster fishing. And there's sort of a big uptick in exploitation of the oyster beds. And once again, we start seeing oysters being shipped throughout the country. During this time, oysters are a food that are eaten by the rich and poor alike. There's not really any particular status assigned to them. It's just everyone will eat them. And then this continues through the medieval period into the post-medieval period, where we really start to see massive exploitation of the oyster beds to the point where they're being substantially overfished in the early modern period. And this all sort of comes to a head in the 20th century when a combination of this massive overfishing and a series of bad conditions and the introduction of oyster diseases that spread around, and the European flat oyster is almost wiped out. Up to 90% of the natural beds around the UK are basically destroyed during this time. And after that, the beds tend to be restocked with the Pacific oyster because it's more commercially viable, more resistant to disease, and it grows faster. But there have been, in recent times, efforts to sort of reintroduce the European oyster. And there's still places where it's being fished today, particularly around Colchester is one of the places where they are still being farmed. So they are still around in the UK. So that's the sort of historical side of the oyster shells. Now, this is represented in the archaeological record by the survival of the oyster shells. The oyster shells will survive quite well given the right conditions. Obviously, even if it wasn't eaten, the fleshy part of the oyster isn't going to be preserved in any way. So all the evidence we have comes from the form of the shells. And if these are left in fairly stable, undisturbed contexts, particularly where the soil isn't too acidic, they will actually survive really well. Large shell dumps sort of can have the ability to basically, the shell, the chemical components of the shell create a little micro environment within the soil, which helps preserve the shell. And given the right conditions, like I say, we can get shells from the Iron Age and be able to recover them by hand on site, and then they get brought back to the lab. So once they come back, so this is a nice picture from one of our sites. This here bag is being filled with oyster shells. So they're just being collected by hand during excavations on site, at which point they are brought back to the lab and given to me. And here it's my job is to firstly conserve the shells in case they're degrading, because once they're dug out of the soil, they tend to need to be stabilized by just being allowed to dry out. And then I need to clean them up ready for analysis. But unlike other types of finds, the oyster shell tends to be a bit more fragile than, say, pottery or animal bone. So we wash it very carefully. We use paintbrushes to make sure we're not removing the shell, because like I said, it grows up in different layers, and it's very easy for those layers to basically become very friable if they're not preserved well, and then they sort of peel off as you're washing them. So you've got to be very careful to try and preserve as much of the evidence during the process as possible. And then when they are all washed up, they are ready to be looked at. So as with any kind of archaeological material from a site, so think of bone, pottery, etc., when we find oyster shells, we're faced with a series of questions that we might want to find out the answers to, but which will tell us a bit about the people and the activities that they were doing in the past, in whichever period it is that these shells have come from. So these questions can more or less be broken down into 4 categories, and each of these will tell us a little bit about the activities in the past. And so the 4 categories are going to be the exploitation of the shells, i.e. how are they being collected, the consumption of the shells, how are they being eaten, secondary uses of the shell, and then eventually the deposition of the shell. We might want to know about all of these different things. So the questions we might have regarding the exploitation of the shells, you might want to ask, where have the shells come from? How have they reached the site? So if we think of a site like Leicester, for instance, it's pretty much as landlocked in the UK as it's possible to get. The moment we find oyster shells in Leicester, we immediately know that we've got evidence for trade links to different regions of Britain. And so if we could find out where the shells come from, that would give us information about trade between different regions, the distribution of shells throughout the country, the different methods they're being taken to market and, yeah, I'd say redistributed. And so that's all the kind of thing that would be very useful for us to know if we're trying to understand how past societies were living. Similarly, the consumption of the shells is important because we want to know the role they played in the diet of the people at the site. Is this something that they were eating a lot of? Is it a staple food, or is it perhaps this is a delicacy? And that ties in with how are they eating the oysters? Are they just throwing them into a stew? Are they eating them raw? And all this kind of evidence will can be brought together to give us a picture of how people are living in the past. And so the other types of questions I want to ask for are secondary uses of the shell. So obviously it goes without saying that the primary use of an oyster shell is to hold the oyster, which you're planning on eating at some point. However, the oyster shell, once you've eaten the oyster, you still have it. And then it's not the case that it's simply always thrown away. We can sometimes identify that the oyster shells have been put to secondary uses. So I've got some pictures of examples here that they might be crushed up and used to temper pottery. So basically they get added to the clay to alter its properties to make it more useful for whatever it is the pot's intended for. And so this is a piece of Iron Age pottery, and you can see it's got all these tiny ground up little white flecks in it, which are actually marine shell. Another possibility is the shells could be used for decoration. So I've got here an example of 2 shells that were recovered from a site in Leicester that have clearly been set into mortar. They've got a nice build-up of mortar with a clear actual surface on it. So maybe they were used as part of the decoration of a building, for instance. They were set into the mortar. And the other option is the shells might be used in craft activity or simply reused as objects in and of themselves. So there's evidence of shells being used for pilgrims' badges, for instance, or shell being used as a raw material for making buttons. And here's an example of a shell from Leicester. It's had a big hole punched through it, so possibly it was being used as a weight of some kind. So while it is true that the majority of time the shells we're looking at are purely evidence of consumption of oyster meat, it is important to recognize that sometimes the shells go on to have a life afterwards. And in some cases, if the shells are crushed up for fertilizer or to be put into the pots, we might not actually have any evidence of the shell. And therefore, it's important to remember that there might have been more shell at the site in the past, but we're not just seeing the full quantity. And the final group of questions we might ask about is the deposition. And this is useful for telling us what's actually been going on at the site. Has a pit been dug and the oysters all just tipped into it after one specific oyster feast? Or do we have perhaps a midden deposit, a kitchen rubbish dump that has been built up over tens of years of use of just shells being thrown away? And that can again tell us about what activities were being carried out at the site. So these are the sorts of questions that we might want answers to those shell. So the next thing to think about is how are we actually going to find out the answers to these questions? And the main way we're going to do that is oysters display a huge variety of variation. And it has been demonstrated that this variation can be linked to characteristics of where the oysters came from and what's been done with them. Even as far back as the Roman period, this was recognized. So we've got a Roman poet who says here, "When I but see the oyster's shell, I look and recognize the river, marsh, or mud where it was first raised." So there's clearly a recognition that there are features on the oyster shell that can tell us a bit about its history. Now, Lucilius had an advantage in that he was looking at nice, fresh, modern to him shells, whereas we're looking at the archaeological shells, so we potentially have lost a lot of the evidence he was using. But there are 3 main forms of evidence that we can still use from the shells, which go a long way to helping us answer those questions. And I've broken them down into these 3 categories. So the first bit of data we might want to look at is the size and shape of the shell. The second, we might look at if infestations and epibionts. So are there creatures living on, have made their homes on the shell, if they burrowed into the shell? Epibionts is a fancy word for little creatures that live on the surface of shells. And the third category is has the shell been modified? Either has the oyster itself modified itself? Has it grown in a particular way to respond to its environment? Or is there evidence of human modification, such as have they cut the shell? So I'm just going to go through these categories of information, because this is the types of information that I will be recording when I am first analyzing my shell assemblage. And it's the data I gather from this recording that I will use to find out. So once I've gone through this, I'm going to go through it fairly generally, because there's sort of too many different variables to cover each one. But then I'm going to use 2 case studies afterwards to show how we can use this data to answer some of those questions that we were asking at the start. So the first set of analyses is the size and the shape of the oyster. And it has been demonstrated that this varies from region to region and is controlled by a huge number of variables. The salinity of the water, the average water temperature, the level of nutrients in the water from which the oyster to feed on, all will have an impact on how fast the shell grows and the maximum size that it can attain. So oysters from different geographical regions will therefore show distinct sizes. There might be a large range of overlap between different regions, but this is a sort of a start from which we can start differentiating between different shell groups. And so the main shell valve used for these measurements is the left valve. So if you remember, that's the one with the larger one with the ribs, and we use it because it is the larger valve, and therefore it gives us the maximum dimensions of the oyster shell. And there's two main measurements. It's very simple. We take the height of the shell, which is the distance from the hinge here at the bottom to the edge there, and the length of the shell, which is just the longest distance from edge to edge perpendicular to the height. So when we take those measurements, we can start comparing different shell groups. And we also want to look at the shape of the shell. Now, the shape of the shell is also, again, is a response to the environment in which the shell was growing. So the classic oyster shape is fairly rounded, but generally the height is larger than the length. But sometimes we get exceptionally tall shells. So these are very streamlined and very, I always get confused with this because I want to say they're long, but technically the length is that one. So they're very tall shells. And these tend to be an adaptation to deeper water where the need a large surface area to stop it sinking into the sediment, but the water currents tend to be stronger. So it wants the shell to be streamlined in order to resist the water currents. However, if the shell is growing in shallower water, it tends to be that the sediment, the mud of the river or river estuary or seabed that it's growing in tends to be softer, and therefore there's a danger of the shell to sink into the sediment. So therefore the adaptation is the shell broadens itself to increase its surface area. So using these, we can start to build up a picture of the location the shell was growing in, and again, differentiate between shells that from different areas and also from different oyster beds. The second group of analyses is my favorite, and this is the infestations and epibionts. So all the little critters that have interacted with the shell whilst it was growing in the sea. So while it's in the sea, the shell is sort of vulnerable to attack or colonization from all the other sea creatures that are living around it. And there's lots of different ones, but I'll just highlight a few. So in this case, this shell here has been attacked and colonized by a type of bristleworm called Polydora ciliata that secretes an acid that allows it basically to burrow into the shell, and it leaves these little etch-like marks all over the shell. There's a different type of worm, a larger worm, also a bristleworm, same family, but this one's called Polydora hoplura, and it's much larger, and it leaves characteristic marks at the margins of the shell, particularly on the inner face of the shell. And then there's worms that build houses on top of the shells. So there's the sabolid family of worms construct little mud houses on the surface of the shells, which they live in. And then there are also creatures that bore into the shell, so they attack the shell. So there's a type of sponge called Cleona salata, which leaves these characteristic holes all over. Again, it's secreting an acid that's boring into the shell, and it's leaving these pock marks all over the shell. And sometimes we might find singular boreholes from where the shell has been attacked by another creature, such as a whelk that tries to bore into the shell because it wants to eat the oyster that's inside. So we get these. And then we get the fairly harmless to the oyster creatures that are just using the shell as a place to build their houses. So we've got barnacles. I'm sure we're all familiar with barnacles. They grow on the shell and they can survive quite nicely in the archaeological record. And even if the barnacle themselves has come off, they leave behind a little scar from where they were attached. And then also tiny little invertebrates called bryozoans might live on the shell, and these form little colonies. So they're very small. This is sort of under 0.5 millimeter across, and it's a little species of bryozoan called Escarella varielosa. And similarly to how different habitats impact different shell growths, different habitats will affect which creatures are present. So again, factors like water salinity will affect how effective things like Cleona salata, that sponge, can't tolerate low salinity in the water. So if you have lots of it, it's telling you that this water has high salinity. So again, this is all adding to this overall idea of what the oyster bed the oysters were growing in looks like. And the third group of analysis are the modifications to the shell. So there's two here that I want to talk about, which relate to the nature of the oyster bed, how crowded the oyster bed is. So if the oyster bed is very crowded, you get reach the point where the oysters start growing on top of each other, and you get this phenomenon called clumping, where basically you have one oyster growing on top of another oyster. And also, if the oysters are all really crowded together, that is obviously going to impact how they can grow. And then you get oysters that have these odd shapes because if you remember, they don't move from where they first settle. So they're entirely dependent on their environment for their shape. So if there happens to be a big rock right here, this oyster is not going to be able to grow through that. So its shape is going to adapt. And so where we get these irregularly shaped oysters, it's an indication that the oyster beds are very crowded. There's also a phenomenon in oysters called chambering, which is where we get these, it's quite hard to take photos of, but I hope you can see there's these little hollow pockets in the oyster. So this would have been a full layer of shell, and then underneath there's a little hollow space. And this is because the oyster is able to adapt its internal shape to react to a change in its environment. Now, chambering is specifically linked to rapid alterations in water salinity, such as you would find in an estuary where you have tides going in and out. So the amount of salt water and fresh water is changing. So that's a good indication of those kinds of conditions. Other modifications might be those made by people. So we might have cuts or notches in the edge of the shells where they've been prized open, or the shells may have evidence of burning. And this is telling us not about how the shells, where the shells were growing, but it's telling us about what's been being done to those shells once they've reached an archaeological site. So from this, we can see there's lots of different areas we can start looking for information in. And there is a fourth area of analysis we could look at that I've not mentioned here, but that's the contextual analysis. So what the site the oysters have come from tells us about the shells. Have they come from a coastal site? Have they come from an inland site? And again, this helps build up a picture of their utilization. So that is a brief overview of the questions we might want to ask and the types of evidence that is available to us to answer those questions. And to try and illustrate how this is carried out, I'm going to talk you through two case studies. One is from Roman Leicester, and the other is from medieval Coventry. So to start with, I'm going to talk to you about a site in Roman Leicester called the Stibby Site, named after the Stibby factory that was on top of the site that was then demolished to make way for the building of a nice new hotel. Those of you who have been familiar with previous ULAS talks have probably come across the Stibby site before. It was excavated back in 2016 and was one of ULAS's major excavations. It had a lot of publicity at the time in Leicester and a little bit of recognition further afield as well, because some nice mosaic pieces were founded. So Stibby is a large urban site. It's in the city centre of Leicester. For those of you who know Leicester, it's just across the road from John Lewis. And during excavations, it's slap bang in the middle, well, it's not in the middle, but it's inside the Roman area of the city. And so going in, we were expecting to find a lot of Roman archaeology. And yeah, we weren't disappointed. There was a huge amount going on. It was a very complex urban site. And there was evidence for large numbers of part of the Roman street plan, housing blocks, possibly part of a theatre, and also, like I say, evidence of high status dwelling from the mosaics. And in amongst the hundreds of boxes of finds that were recovered from the site, a few thousand oyster shells were also recovered, dated to the Roman occupation at the site. Now, this was all going on while I was still studying at university here in Leicester, and I was lucky enough, and ULAS were kind enough to let me have a look at this material as part of my dissertation. So I was able to analyze it. And what I did is I selected 7 shell groups from across the site, which totaled just over 1,200 shells. And I recorded all of these, and these came from 3 the 7 shell groups came from across 3 different phases of occupation at the site, which pretty much covered the whole Roman period from the 1st century right the way through to the 4th century. And the reason I selected these 7 groups was these were the largest groups and had the most potential, I thought, to answer some of the questions I had. And the 2 main aims that I had from these shells was I wanted to identify the source of the shells. Obviously, being in Leicester, they're not local. And I also wanted to investigate whether there was any evidence of the Roman exploitation of the shells, because as we said, during the Iron Age, there's no sort of management of the oyster beds. And I wanted to see if there was any evidence of this practice starting to be adopted when the Romans come along. So they were my 2 main aims of the analysis. Now, Leicester is lucky enough to have had several large major urban excavations, and from several of these, oyster shells have in fact already been looked at. So I was lucky in that I already had a pool of data to compare my findings to. And what I discovered is that the majority of the shells followed the pattern that had been observed in previous Roman excavations, in that they were originating from the East Coast. I'm going to explain exactly how I found that out just a second. But so they were coming from the East Coast, particularly the area around Colchester, the Essex estuaries, such as the Blackwater estuary. This was the area the shells were coming from. And this makes sense if you look at the map, that this is the sort of closest area to Leicester where there were natural oyster beds. It's not known whether or not there were native oyster beds up north of Leicester in the Humber or anywhere along that coast, but we know for a fact there were plenty of Roman natural oyster beds along this area. And so in that respect, it wasn't surprising. There was a bit of evidence that some of my shell groups were mixed, i.e. the shells had shells from multiple different places had all been dumped together, which was confusing the analysis a bit because it made it a bit harder to work out exactly where the shells were coming from. But by and large, like I say, they all matched this group. Except for one group of shells did not follow this trend. And this was a group of shells that came from context 1130, which is just the number that refers to the area of site where the shells came from. So I'm going to call this group 1130. And this displayed quite different characteristics from the rest of the oysters. So context 1130 was very distinctive in a number of ways. And the first thing that was obvious when I looked at them was these shells were much bigger than the other shells coming from the site. So they were measured. The measurement I used was the left valve maximum diameter, which is simply the largest diameter of the left valve, either the height or the length. And the average of that came out at 90.7 millimeters, which is substantially larger than the average, both from other shell groups in Leicester, from this site, and from other shell groups in Leicester in total, which averaged at about just under 80 millimeters. Unfortunately, in archaeology, you're not allowed to leave it there. You can't just say 90 is bigger than 79, off you go. So the way I checked this was with various statistical tests. Now, I don't want to go into this in too much depth because it's a little bit complicated and not terribly interesting. But essentially what I did is I took the measurements and I used different statistical tests to compare them. And this will tell me whether or not they are significantly different or not significantly different. And if they're not significantly different, that might mean the differences are just caused by the fact that these are samples of samples and they're not real. So these are my 7 groups from Leicester, from Stibby rather, and I compared them to each other. And what I discovered was context 1130, you see here on the column on the far right, no matter which statistical test I put the data into, was always substantially different to the other contexts. So where these cells in the table are highlighted in red, that's recording they are significantly different. So 1130 is different to all the other shells. The other shell groups all had at least one common match with other shell groups, meaning that they couldn't be sort of distinguished into separate groups. They were all from the East Coast. But this one, 1130, was substantially different. And it wasn't only the shape, the size data that was different. They also had very different infestation characteristics. In particular, they had a high number of infestations of this worm, Polydora hoplura. Now, this worm is a very useful worm archaeologically because we know that its distribution is limited to the south coast. That's its modern distribution, and in the study of thousands of ancient shells, it's never turned up in shells that are known to be from the south coast. So this worm, its presence is pretty much a very good indicator that the shells you're dealing with have come from the south coast or southwest, anywhere sort of along that Cornish coastline, Bristol Channel kind of region, all the way along to sort of Southampton. There was also a high frequency of boreholes. About 10% of the oyster shells had been attacked by some kind of whelks, and this is again more prevalent in south coast shells, although those from the east coast do have boreholes as well, but just not as high numbers. So already we've got a couple of indicators that the shells from context 1130 are from a different source region to the rest of them. But so in order to find out where they came from, I apologize that there's going to be some more stats. What I did is I widened my search. I compared them to shells from other shells from Leicester, shells from other areas around the country. So in total, I compared them to shells from 15 different sites, totaling 54 shell groups. And I included both east and south coast groups in my analysis. And in every single instance, pretty much, I had significantly different results. So these shells were different to the shells from all of these other sites, until I came down to this site here, Greyhound Yard, which is the name of a Roman site on the Pool waterfront, or just removed from the Pool waterfront. And here, the shells were shown to be not significantly different. And in fact, they were actually quite close matches. I then found some modern data of oysters from Pool, and again, they were not significantly different. So it seems that these oysters are very similar to oysters from Pool, and they are much larger than those from all other places in the country. And this ties in quite nicely with the historical record, because Pool has always been renowned for the size of its oysters. And I've got a quote here from Daniel Defoe, writing in 1724, that Pool is famous for the best and biggest oysters in all this part of England. So the oysters from Pool seem to have a very distinct characteristic that they are very large. And the fact that my shells share this is a good indicator that they may have come from Pool. However, in order to finalize this, what I did is I also did some analysis of the infestations. And this is what is known as principal component analysis. It's quite complicated. I'm not going to try and explain it all, but just bear with me when I say it does make sense. So what I used is I took 6 different types of infestation that had been occurring in my assemblage, and I found the data from all the other sites, and then I used principal component analysis, which attempts to basically split the data into groups and identify which of the different elements is driving the variation within the samples. So it's quite complicated, but basically if you look here, it has split the shells into roughly 2 groups either side of the axis. We've got all these are east coast shells here, and they form a very tight group around here. All the ones labeled E are shells from the east coast, whereas all the ones labeled S are shells from the south coast. They're a bit more scattered around, but again, they're distinct from the east coast shells by and large in that they're on the right of the axis. And then this dot here represents context 1130, our context, and this dot here is shells from Pool. So they map very closely together, indicating that they have the similar infestation characteristics within the assemblage. So for me, this is allows me to say that I am now confident in the fact that I can say that, oh yeah, so that's the east coast ones, that's south coast ones. I am confident in saying that these shells came from Pool Harbour, which is down here, and not from the Essex estuaries over here. And what we have is, in fact, evidence of a new source of shells that are supplying Roman Leicester. And what these shells are actually dated towards the end of the Roman period. So possibly this is telling us that by this point, the trade links have become well established enough that you can get seafood from the south coast up to Leicester in a short enough time that it's not going to be horribly off and inedible by the time it reaches there. So that shows how we can sort of use these different characteristics to distinguish between different shell groups. And if you remember, my other aim was to identify, is there any evidence of a change in the methods of exploitation of the oyster beds? And to begin with, there wasn't any evidence that the oyster beds were anything other than natural oyster beds that the Romans were just coming along and taking the shells from. They had a high amount of the clumping and irregularly shaped shells that we would expect in an unmanaged population where the shells are just growing all over each other, which indicates natural beds. However, there was some evidence of exploitation in the attachment materials. So when the oyster larva settles on a place it wants to grow, sometimes the material it settles on becomes attached to the shell because it's cementing itself to it. And we can see here that these shells have been attached to broken up mussel shell and broken up cockle shell. And I had another shell in the group that appeared to be attached to some kind of ceramic material. Also, some of the shells had strange indentations in them. So you can see in this shell here, it's got a sort of a groove running down the center of the shell. And that's because the shell has obviously been growing around something. And it looks like it's been growing around maybe a branch or a twig or something. And what this is possibly evidence for is the fact that the Romans are modifying the shell beds. And so this is possibly the simplest type of exploitation and modification of shell beds you can do, is they're spreading material onto the sea floor to give the oysters more room, more available material to settle on, in order to encourage the oyster beds to grow and become larger. So what is particularly noticeable is that all these types of shell that are in the attachment points are from edible species, so cockles and mussels. And so this is possibly evidence of the fact that these are the leftover products from mussels and cockles have been eaten, and then the shells are being recycled back into the oyster beds to spread out. And it's possible that's where my piece of ceramic came from. It's just broken up tile that is being spread onto the oyster shells. Similarly with branches. They could be adding those to the oyster beds just to increase the surface area. Now, the technical name for this is called spreading culch. Culch is just the word used for the variety of material that the shell attaches to. So there is possible evidence here that the Romans are artificially modifying the beds that the oysters are growing in. So the conclusions from this study show that how we can use the types of evidence from the oysters to answer our questions. So we've discovered that there's a new source of oysters supplying Roman Leicester with these shells from the south coast. And we've also got some early evidence of the Romans altering the oyster beds. And what's particularly interesting is context 1130, which are these south coast shells, was in fact came from a part of the city that's linked to this possible theatre. And so that immediately asks the question, are these shells special if they're from a unique source and they're associated with a large public building? And there's a clear, there's evidence that the Romans definitely ascribed different values to shells from different regions. They were aware that shells from different regions had different characteristics and tastes. And so we've got a Roman writer, Juvenal, saying that he's writing about a famous Roman gourmet called Montanus, and saying that no matter where the oysters were bred, just from tasting it, he could taste the difference. So there's a clear understanding that the Romans were aware that shells from different areas had different tastes, different properties. So it might be interesting to see if South Coast shells in Leicester, if any more turn up, are they also associated with high status public buildings? Are shells from the South Coast regarded, due to their larger size and different taste, as being of a superior quality? So this has actually thrown up some new questions that hopefully future evidence will be able to answer. So moving on to a slightly briefer second study of some shells from Coventry. These are shells from the medieval Charterhouse, which is a Carthusian monastery in Coventry. that was constructed in the medieval period in the late 1300s and had a relatively short 250-year life before Henry VIII decided he didn't quite like monasteries and had the whole thing torn down in the dissolution. Well, most of it. A few buildings did survive. So this is the layout of the monastery. So what you have is a central court area here, and around it you've got the prior's house up here, you've got the service buildings here, and then around this central court you've got all the different monks' cottages called cells. So each monk would have lived in a little cottage, which these are, and then out the back of their cottage they had a garden, and then the entire thing was encased in this precinct wall here. And my aims for this particular site were to investigate the exploitation of oysters in the medieval period and see if I can detect the development of more advanced oyster fishing practices, whether or not we've got commercialization of oyster fishing in this period. And also I wanted to investigate the consumption of oysters at the monastery. So the Carthusians, they don't eat meat, but they are allowed to eat fish. So it'll be interesting to see how big a role oysters are playing in their diet. And what's nice is to have such a well understood historical building is that we're able to possibly link specific consumption practices and deposition practices to really specific activities that were being carried out within the monastery. So before I go on to the next slide, just try to remember this picture here, that we've got cottages arranged around an internal cell, gardens out the back of the cottages with an outer precinct wall. And this was the site where the shell's coming from. So they're currently doing renovations at the chart house. And this area here, I believe, is going to be what's under their new cafe. And this is part of the monastery. And what we see is a series of walls here. So we've got two main walls here. So this wall here on the left, that is the outer precinct wall. That is the wall that was going around the outside of all of those monks' cottages and gardens. And this wall here is a boundary in between two different monks' cottages. On either side of that, we have an area of the monks' gardens here, and then the cottages themselves would have been up here. There was slight evidence that this stone here may have been like a part of the footing of one of the cottages, but unfortunately that was outside the area of the excavation. And then we've also got a little dwarf wall here. It's the footing of a wall that would have supported a covered walkway, allowing the monk to get from his cottage right to the end of the garden, even when it was raining. And then, so this is all, the stuff on the right is all on the inside of the monastery, on the inside of the outer precinct wall. And then on the left, you can see we've got this big spread of rubble here. And this was a big area that's all linked to when Henry VIII had the monastery pulled down. And so this rubble is from the destruction of the monastery. And it's in this area here, on the outside of the precinct wall, hidden away amongst all the disturbed layers of rubble, that the large deposit of oysters was found that I'm going to be talking to you about. So here we have a picture of the oysters being excavated. This is John, one of the ULAS archaeologists, actually digging them out. Here they are being collected, and this is after the area had been excavated. And so we've got down here at the bottom a section drawing, which shows the different layers of rubble. So this layer here at the bottom, labeled 318, this is the original monastic ground layer. So this is the medieval layer of the ground. And all my oysters came from the layer of rubble numbered 346. So this is the layer that's sitting directly on top of this monastic ground level. There's a spread of rubble here that it came for it. And then it's sealed over by further layers of rubble that came from the dissolution of the monastery. So what we didn't know at the time that I made this presentation, that has actually come to light recently, is that recently there was a small excavation on the other side of the wall, and some layers there were taken down, and no oysters were found on the inner side of the wall. which indicates that this shell, all the shell came from a dump of shell that was on the outside of the wall, possibly right up against it. And so it's been interpreted that this is evidence of where they were dumping shell, so just waste shell out the back on the other side of the walls, out of the way. And then during the dismantling of the monastery, obviously it's all been disturbed and the shell has become mixed in with all of the rubble. So here are the shells. It was all from a single context. So it's all from one shell group, and in total there were 578 shells. The majority of them were the cupped left valve. There were fewer right valves, but still significant numbers of both shells. And the preservation was relatively good, meaning that I could measure a large number of them and also be able to record a large number of parasites and shell modifications. So I've got a large pool of data to pull from when I start trying to investigate my different questions. So, like I say, my main aims are how are the shells being fished and how are they being consumed. But before I do any of that, I did a quick analysis just to determine the source. And as you can see, this is going to look very familiar from the previous case study, but I've got my little friendly worm, Polydora hoplura, also in this shell assemblage, and also a large number of boreholes. So again, I'm looking at a south coast distribution. And then I compared it to other medieval sites. This time, however, they're incredibly different from the shells from Poole. They're far, far smaller. So this time, we're not looking at shells from Poole. And in fact, the only comparative shells I could find were from Ludgershall Castle, which is in Wiltshire. And it's believed that that castle was provisioned from shells from around the Solent. So it's likely that my shells shared a similar source. So once again, we can pinpoint roughly where the shells were coming from in the country. And this time it's somewhere in the Solent towards Poole, but not Poole itself. So this wasn't the main aim of the study, but it's nice just to have that information to hand. So the main thing I want to look at is, has the exploitation of the shells changed from when we have Romans and Iron Age people just picking up shells and possibly just beginning to modify the oyster beds? Have we got a change now we're in the medieval period where we can detect that the exploitation has been developed and become more advanced? And I'm going to immediately suggest that there are a number of characteristics that do indeed indicate that these shells are being more heavily exploited. To begin with, the shape of the shells, which I have looked at here just by plotting the length against the height. And as you can see from this, they are generally tall, i.e. the height of the shells is increasing faster than the length. So if you remember back, this is telling us they're from deep water. And immediately this tells us that they're not being casually picked up from intertidal beds, because these shells are almost certainly from such a depth that they are permanently covered by water, and therefore they're going to need to be collected from a boat. In addition to the shape of the shells, mixed in with the shells was a number of shells of other species. So here's an example of a whelk that was from the shells. There are quite a number of whelks, and also mussel shells. And these species are, again, species that are linked with deeper water, and therefore probably been collected up with the oysters, transported with the oysters, all just mixed together, and have ended up in the same place. Again, indicating the shells are from deeper water. There was also a lack of chambering in the shells, and also chalky deposits, which I haven't mentioned, but these two are linked to the shell trying to adapt to rapidly changing environments, such as from an estuary. And deeper water tends to be more stable in average water temperature, salinity, and other factors, which is why we have an absence of these kinds of characteristics. So immediately, I've got an indication that these shells are from deep water. And the main way that you collect shells from deep water is with either you use some kind of net to dredge them up, or you might use a rake to bring them to the surface, or some other collection method. And I looked again at the data, and there is some evidence that they may have been using nets. So this is the size distribution of the shells. And if you look at the blue shells, the blue bars, sorry, these are the left valves and all the different size classes. So these are here are the smallest shells, these here are the bigger shells. I had one large shell that was a bit of an outlier in the group. But if what the data shows me is that the shells are from a very narrow range of sizes, and also there is a more gradual drop off towards the larger shells, and it's more steep towards small shells, meaning there's a smaller proportion of small shells. And if you were using a net to fish the shells up, you would expect to have fewer small shells, because these would be being, the net wouldn't be collecting these, depending on obviously the size of the holes in the mesh. So if you're using a dredge net, what you're doing is you're not collecting these smaller shells. Obviously, a few will get mixed in, but by and large, you're only collecting the larger shells, and then that's why there's a more gradual tail off towards the larger shells and a steeper angle towards the smaller ones. It's worth noting that this isn't represented in the right valves, because obviously the right valve is already connected to the left valve, so they've come out together. So that's why we're getting smaller right valves than the left valves. It's nothing to do with the size of the mesh. So this immediately suggests that we've got some level of organization in the exploitation of these oyster beds. There's also a lack of clumped up shells and irregular shells, which suggests that they were being dredged regularly, and the net passing through the shell beds had the effect of spreading out the shells, giving them space to grow, so they're not confined in these really overcrowded beds, which reduces the need of the shells to grow on top of each other and to adopt these weird shapes. So all of this evidence, when put together, evidence of the regular dredging, the use of nets, the exploitation of deep water beds, shows that we've moved on from this Roman exploitation of just gathering shells as they come, and now we've actually got managed beds that are being regularly tended to collect the shells. And very briefly, I also wanted to look at the consumption of the shells and how the shells were being eaten. So like I said earlier, this is a Carthusian monastery. These monks weren't allowed to eat meat, but were allowed to eat fish and all the weird things medieval people classed as fish. And this was very much in evidence from the bone assemblage that I also looked at from this site. We had lots of fish bones. We had evidence of salmon, cod, conger eel, herring, a huge range of fish being eaten, as well as this large dump of oyster shells. And so there's various different ways that you can deal with oyster shells. In the medieval period, it was generally discouraged from eating them raw. All the writers say they will give you bad humors, humoral theory sort of being the dominant way of looking at health in the period. And the idea was if you ate oysters raw, it will give you bad humors. And this is possibly linked to the fact that obviously it was harder to keep the oysters fresh, and so oysters probably made people sick quite a lot, and they wouldn't have tasted as nice, because especially here at Coventry, where it's taken a while to bring them up, they probably wouldn't have tasted very nice. However, despite the documentary evidence suggesting that it's a bad idea to eat them raw, we know they were still alive when they reached the site, because they've had to be prized open. If the shell wasn't alive, the valves you could just pull the valves apart and get access to the shell. But we get these really sharply defined notches in the margins of the shell, and also these sort of arcing cuts into the shell. And basically what's happened is they've prized the edge of the shell open with a knife, which has created this cut in the shell. They've stuck the knife in, and then they've wiggled it in this side-to-side motion inside the shell. And what they're essentially trying to do is sever that adductor muscle, the muscle that's in the center of the shell holding the two valves tightly together. They've tried to sever that in order to bring the two shells apart and access the oyster in the middle. So these shells were clearly arrived at site alive. Now, it's harder to find evidence of how they were eaten, because if they were just popped out of the shell and thrown into a stew, then we're not really going to be able to see any evidence of that on the shell. However, we do have some evidence that maybe they were in fact being eaten raw, contrary to the popular opinion at the time. And this evidence comes in the fact that, if you remember, I said there were more left valves in the assemblage than right valves. And part of the reason this is the left valve was often used as a way of presenting the oyster. So here we have a painting by, I'm going to say, Ozias Beert the Elder, painted in 1620, called Dishes with Oysters, Fruit and Wine. And what this picture shows is the presentation of oysters served raw, but presented within that left valve of the shell. And the fact that we've got more left valves in our assemblage possibly indicates that the shells were opened, the right valve was discarded at that point, and then the oysters were brought to the table and eaten out of their shell, and then the left valve was disposed of then and has ended up in a different rubbish dump to the right valve, which is why we have this over-representation of the left valves within the assemblage. So we do have some tentative evidence to suggest that maybe they were eating the oysters raw. It's almost certain that they were in fact enjoying oysters in a variety of ways, but it is nice to have this little snapshot as to how the monks might have been living and what a typical meal may have included. So that pretty much sums up the evidence from this case study for Coventry. And indeed, I hope that the two case studies have shown how we can use the evidence of the different shell characteristics that we have gathered to start answering the questions we had about the shells, that are in turn revealing what activities were being carried out in the past and sort of how life was being carried out with regards to oyster consumption. So that is pretty much all I have to say on the matter. I hope you've enjoyed the talk.
Thanks, Will. That was a brilliant talk. I think every time I listen to you talk about oysters, I learn something new. Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions for Will, if you want to type them into the chat box, and I will read them out for him to answer. Whilst you're thinking of them, I've got a question, Will.
Yep.
In the Roman oysters, so when you were talking about the evidence, some of them showed evidence of management. Was that the East Coast or the South Coast, or both?
The shells that particularly showed evidence for management were in the East Coast group. I had 6 East Coast groups and only 1 South Coast group, so I did have quite a lot more East Coast shells to draw upon. But no, there was no particular evidence. It'd have been nice if they were in the South Coast group, because that was the chronologically later group, so it would have been nice to sort of see a development in it. But it is possible that they were being managed in a way that just wasn't visible to us archaeologically anymore.
Would you, I mean, could it be because the East Coast is being overexploited that you start seeing management come in, or?
That is a theory that's been put forward. So this practice has been observed at other sites sort of on the coast itself. And yeah, it's sort of the Romans, when they arrive, all the natural oyster beds aren't really being exploited, and there's a really abundant resource. But after a couple of 100 years, they perhaps realize that they're not going to last forever unless they do something. And it's at this point that they start modifying the beds to try and encourage more oyster growth.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so Joan asks, how would the oysters have been kept alive during transport?
So this is a question that has been asked quite a few times, because there's documentary sources saying that Roman emperors particularly liked British oysters and had them shipped all the way over to Rome. So clearly there was a way of keeping them alive. It's been suggested by sort of experimental approaches that an oyster can survive up to 10 days out of water if you pack them really tightly together to prevent the shells from opening. Because basically the oyster has its own little reservoir of water inside the shell. And so while that little reservoir will keep it going for 10 days, provided obviously it doesn't open and lose that water. So for sort of the trade up and inside Britain, they would have presumably made use of the Roman road network. So Leicester's quite well situated on the main north-south route through the UK. But it's also possible that there may have been barges going along the coasts or up some of the rivers. And yeah, you've got this sort of 10-day window. But it is possible that we're only seeing south coast oysters in Leicester in the later periods, because it's at this point that the road network has become sort of developed and sophisticated enough that they can now actually manage this distribution in the time. In terms of taking them from, say, Britain to Rome, it's been suggested that the ship would have made the journey in a series of steps. It would have just been stopping off at ports along the way, and then the oysters can be sort of basically dunked back in the water while the ship is stopped to sort of try and keep them alive. And at certain ports along the Mediterranean coast, they have excavated these sort of deep timber-lined pits that would have been below the tidal level. And there's some tentative explanation that maybe these are oyster pits that the oysters are being put into to sort of rejuvenate them for the next step of the journey, as it were.
Okay.
So
I think that probably covers it, yeah. Jennifer says, thank you very much for such an informative talk. I had no idea oyster shells could be so interesting. Okay, so Caroline asks, are freshwater oysters in evidence?
I've not got any evidence for freshwater species of oyster. We've got freshwater mussels, they're coming in, but all the oysters that I've been dealing with have been marine saltwater oysters. The European flap oyster is basically only lives in either proper salt water or at least very brackish conditions. It can live in estuaries, but it doesn't tend to go much further upriver than that. So it's definitely coming from the coast.
Sort of linking back in with transporting oysters, there's been a so Carol asks, how would they have kept them cool when transporting them? I don't know if you need to or not.
I've seen it suggested, and I'm not entirely sure, I'll be honest, where this has come from, whether it's sort of from a written source from a Roman period, or maybe a mosaic picture, because that's how we get a lot of our information on oyster management, from images in mosaics. But it's been suggested that you pack them really tightly in barrels of so they can't open. You then fill the barrel with seawater, seal the top of the barrel, and then they're just transported in that, and presumably the combination of the barrel and the seawater is enough to keep it going. It's worth pointing out that we do have evidence that not all oysters did survive the journey. We sometimes find deposition where the two valves are still together. So presumably that's where someone's picked up the oyster, given it a sniff, gone, no thanks, and just chucked that straight into the rubbish pit.
Jim asks, how long do you think it would actually take to transport oysters from Hampshire to Coventry in medieval times?
In medieval times, I assume that it's going to be relatively well-established trade routes. Got to remember the Charterhouse, it's a monastic site, so it sort of falls under the category of high-status sites. So they're bringing in food from across the country, whatever they want to eat. I don't want to sort of be drawn to giving a number of days. I've not seen any sort of, I don't have a good guess on that, I'm afraid. But presumably within the period that they would have been nice. The fact that they're being eaten raw suggests that they are at least fresh enough to the taste isn't going to be too bad. Because normally what happens, the evident documentary sources say, if they've gone a bit off, you just chuck them in a stew with a whole load of spices and then hope no one notices. But if you're eating them raw, they would have probably been served with some kind of spicing or sauce as well. But they're still relatively fresh. So I'm going to say within that 10-day window, certainly.
I mean, presumably, if you wouldn't see evidence of oysters if they're being opened on the coast and then transported, say,
no, so
or something.
That is, so particularly when oysters are being mass produced and are seen as, in the Victorian period, they're almost a food of the poor. These are oysters that are being shucked out of the shells on the coast. There's evidence for like huge shell dumps on the coast where they're just popping them out of the shell. And then the meat itself could be salted, could be pickled. And at that point, it can be, it can be transported much further. But that is seen sort of as a lower status kind of way of eating your oyster.
Okay, so a few more questions. Amanda asks, did the Romans develop a special tool to open oysters like the modern day version?
We've not ever found any of these tools, but there is a remarkable consistency in sort of the shape of the notches that are being broken into the edge of the shells. So the one I showed you from Charterhouse was a really deep V, and that's sort of typical medieval ones. But in Roman times, they break into sort of a W pattern. So there's like two joined V's together. And this has been seen in, it's referenced in shells from sites across the country. So there's clearly a standard practice of opening oyster, and I wouldn't be surprised if it involved a specific tool for the purpose.
Okay, and then we've got, would the parasites that attached or bored into the oysters have been eaten with the oyster?
So most of the parasites, in fact, nearly all of them, they live on the shell itself rather than the oyster. So for instance, the boreholes that I showed pictures of, all of those ones are holes that they've not penetrated right through the shell. The oyster has survived the attack. If it goes all the way through the shell, that whelk is then going to eat the oyster. That's what its end goal is. So it's not going to end up on the human food chain. The other things that sort of live on the shells, the sponges, the little worms, they are sort of restricted to the shell itself, and they don't actually interact with the oyster. If a parasite does get into the oyster, that's when we start getting into the territory of pearl formation, because the oyster doesn't sees the parasite as an irritant, and what it does is it encases it within these this layer of shell-like material, which is actually how pearls form. So it's unlikely that the people would have been eating the parasites themselves, but it has been suggested that certain shells that were particularly heavily infested, obviously these aren't presentable, you can't send them up to the table, so it does dictate the way in which the oyster is consumed, and the more infested shells are possibly going to be, that oyster is going to end up in a stew rather than a nice clean shell which you can send out to the dinner table.
I think that was the last question.